So, how do you see the role of religion when it comes to a person's identity and craving for self determination?
The first thing that I've realized is oftentimes religion is weaponized to justify oppressive cultural norms. And I think that in itself is something that's really big to unpack. Because we've seen religion being weaponized as a tool of colonialism. We've seen religion being weaponized as a tool to perpetuate different forms of oppression, whether that's homophobia, transphobia, institutional racism. Like all of that has been justified through like religion, right? And it's false, but it is, the experience still is true, right? Like obviously when we deconstruct it, we're like, you can kind of peel back the layers, but there is truth to that experience that religion is often conflated with culture.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night to all of you. And today we are going to do something which we have never done before. This is Middle East Insights platform. I'm Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, and today we are going to talk about the existence of queer and trans people across Southwest and South Asia and North Africa. Um, for the discussion of it, we have Sahibzada Mayed, who is a decolonial researcher and designer committed to dismantling oppressive systems and cultivating pathways for collective liberation. Through genderful fashion, they have created spaces to celebrate the beauty of diverse gender expressions and disrupt the gender binary. So I would like to really welcome you, Mayed, today.
Yeah,
And thank you so much for the privilege of your time. And I'm
yeah.
going to
Thanks for
take
having
that
me.
shawl away from you whenever I visit you. So, my first question to you is that what do you mean by um, just like we'll go from zero? What do you mean by queer people and trans people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to start off. I would say, to me, it is really a fluid and emergent definition, right? Obviously, English is one of the most widely spoken languages across the world, hence there is some power in being able to have like um I guess language, being able to have language to even name this experience of not fitting within the gender binary, not conforming to gender roles and expectations. So I really see it as a placeholder rather than like a defining category, because I also think that we need to be expansive with our language. And I know the language doesn't really resonate with everyone and it doesn't have to, but we still need to be able to communicate in some way. So that's really, yeah, I think I see it as a placeholder because we actually have language in so many different cultures and so many different communities that captures that experience of gender diversity, sexual diversity, and just trying to see how that maps out across borders, across cultures, across communities. There's actually a lot more than one term could ever capture. So I don't want us to really get caught up on the term because that's really a placeholder around this more expansive experience that is shared across communities.
And when you describe yourself as a decolonial researcher, and we are talking about the context of North Africa, Southwest Asia, South Asia. In your own personal professional life, how difficult was it, the entire challenge of even understanding what you have to deconstruct and bringing people into awareness?
Mm. Yeah, I think one of the things that I have been really unpacking is decolonization is not like a universal like cookie cutter methodology that people can apply. So it's one of the I think one of the largest misconceptions around it is that it can be applied universally across contexts in the same way in a unified manner. But I think it actually is more challenging because I think it has to be taken within context of place and space and time, and it has to be applied. So all that to say that anytime we talk about decolonization, we really need to root it in the grassroots, local, indigenous struggles for self-determination, resurgence that happen across all of these regions. So I think which is counter to how all of our areas have been sort of artificially divided by constructed borders, and the whole idea of the nation state in itself has to be challenged for us to effectively talk about and even think about and imagine decolonial futures. So that's the first thing I would say is something to keep in mind, that this is not something that even across, even if we look at South and West Asia, it's a massively diverse region, and it's really difficult to have one lens to view it from. So that's the first thing I will start off by saying. That's been one of the biggest challenges, is how do you create a shared language and framework around this when you're trying to do this work? Because in essence, it's hard to unify. I think the other thing is specifically if we kind of tie it back to our topic today, I think there's so many layers that you kind of need to unpack because, so I'll give an example to kind of contextualize. One of the first things and one of the most common pushbacks I would say you face when you're trying to really elevate queer, trans, gender nonconforming communities is that this is a Western ideology. And how do you critique something that's so deep rooted? Because essentially what has happened over centuries is any form of gender diversity has been erased. And I would say I want to take that back. Not erased. I would say it has been invisibilized or rendered invisible by design. And I think there's a difference because those communities still exist and they have existed. But it's like they've been systematically subjected to different forms of oppression that has rendered them invisible. So I think the language work there is really important. But so one of the challenges I face is like a lot of people think that rejecting this idea of gender diversity is anti-imperial because they see this as the Western ideology. So they see this as standing against Western imperialism when they critique gender diversity. And I'm like, you can critique some of the things within that I agree are Eurocentric, but you can't erase the fact that like gender diverse people have existed. If we look at the subcontinent, they've existed for centuries, if not millennia, right? And we have history to prove that, but you really have to then ask like whose narratives are we centering and what histories are forgotten or erased intentionally. So I'll kind of pause there. I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but
No, it's actually important because the idea of, this um, exogenous idea of a nation state, which most of the conflicts around that we are seeing in the world are because of these artificial borders which have divided ethnicities. But at the same time, how do you see religion? What is the role of religion when one wants to have self-determination? Because, for example, in Hindu mythology, we have always had the concept of, a queer, be it be it Arjun being a queer in one of the incidents during Mahabharat, or even in most of our texts. So, how do you see the role of religion when it comes to a person's identity and craving for self-determination when um, the religious preachers try to confine them and say that no, this is wrong?
yeah, I think that's a loaded, very loaded question. So let's unpack that in like chunks. I think the first thing that I've realized is oftentimes religion is weaponized to justify oppressive cultural norms. And I think that in itself is something that's really big to unpack. because we've seen religion being weaponized as a tool of colonialism. We've seen religion being weaponized as a tool to perpetuate different forms of oppression, whether that's homophobia, transphobia, um, institutional racism. Like all of that has been justified through like religion, right? And it's false, but it is the experience still is true, right? Like obviously when we deconstruct it, we're like you can kind of peel back the layers, but there is truth to that experience that religion is often conflated with culture. So I think there has to be a very intentional and careful decoupling of religion and culture. Like what are cultural norms and what are religious practices, and where do they maybe overlap, but also where do they diverge? Because oftentimes they're unified as one. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that religion and spirituality, I would say, kind of go hand in hand, but they're not necessarily equal to each other. And I think I see, especially within queer and trans communities, I see a lot more of spiritual connection, whether that's to land, whether that's to like the more than human world versus to organized religion. And maybe that is because of what has happened over time and how religion has been weaponized. But I think that's definitely something to kind of hold as we have this discussion. And the third thing that I'll say right now is that when we're talking about religion, like, and I want to say this is pretty true globally, that if we truly look at religion and the ideologies and try to unpack that, I would say many of them are justice oriented and they are preaching peace. And that's not to say that if a religion preaches peace and is justice oriented, people will exactly follow that. That doesn't speak to individual actions. But I think dehumanization still isn't part of it. And I can speak from my own experiences. If we look at Islam as an example, it's like, even if we can say that being queer is forbidden, like let's take that as an example, but from a religious perspective, does that justify violence and dehumanization upon people who are queer? Absolutely not. So human rights frameworks are really, really important to talk about religion and religion and gender and sexuality. When we kind of have those and put those together, I think we need to have a human rights framework that has to be upheld. And I think that is one of the fundamentals. What does play a role and is often less talked about is patriarchy, or patriarchal oppression and culture and dominant cultural norms, and how those actually drive homophobia, transphobia, anti-queer, anti-trans violence, and dehumanization. And I think unpacking dehumanization is really, really important, right? Because that is at the root cause of so many different forms and layers of oppression that we see, right?
Yep. And dehumanization, along with religion and the oppressive practices of religion, as well as the very nexus of patriarchy. And the most interesting thing is that often patriarchy is not only about men trying to control the narrative, even women subjugating themselves and bringing themselves into the paradox. But don't you think that if we are having a discussion about human rights framework, states have a lot of power in creating it, but in most of the states, queer people, trans people do not hold positions of power. They are not given positions of power. So, how can the change happen? Only through civil society? Do you think it is strong enough?
Yeah, I think that's like a challenging question, right? Because it's like in the current forms of government that exist tied to nation states, I think we have to understand the history, right? I mean, I say this all the time, that colonialism in itself is probably the deadliest form of gender-based violence, whether we look at violence against women, whether we look at violence against queer and trans people, or just how ideas of masculinity and femininity are constructed. All of that can be connected and tied back to colonial logics and practices, right? So that's why I see these as interconnected. And when we first started our discussion today, I tried to start with nation state. Why is that important? Because you need to start from the foundations, the root causes here that are perpetuating these. So when you're saying that there's lack of political representation within communities that are gender diverse, that is by design. And that is tied to the nation state and how nation states are constructed and how that's happened over time. Because if we look at different models of just community organizing and relationship, then we might have different like outcomes, right? So part of, I would say, decolonization work has to really heavily focus on critiquing the nation state, dismantling it, and understanding like what would it mean to truly recenter indigenous practices of being in community with the land and with each other, right?
Yeah, and you're in US right now where Trump is going to eventually come back tomorrow with Make America Great Again and close off all the borders. So the fluidity of even thinking about, you know, challenging the idea of a nation state under his rule is going to be more difficult in US. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like, there is going to, like, there likely already are legitimate and valid fears around political repression, institutional violence, and that has existed too. So I think it will be exacerbated, but it's also important to kind of recenter the focus here that if we look at indigenous communities on Turtle Island, they have continued to exist through all of the different types of colonial violence, institutional violence they've been subjected to, and they're still here and present. So I think when we start to recenter the focus on how do we really tangibly support and build indigenous resurgence and resistance to the nation state, then that is how we talk about like how do we sustain that, right? Because I think sometimes it's also like we can take that conversation to the idea of change, right? Like what is sustainable change, but also what is the timeline of change? And I think we sometimes we want immediate results, and the reality is I don't think any nation state currently is going to be dismantled like literally
Yeah,
tomorrow, right?
yeah.
It's just like in our current world that we live in, the reality is these states have been drawn up and very intentionally by design. And there's a lot of different powers at play that keep it and maintain it this way. So it's like it's going to be a very slow unraveling that likely neither you or I are going to see within our lifetimes, right?
You're
So I
way
think,
younger than me. I hope that you are able to see some part of it. But the point is also how do you process respect with your identity when the world that you are surrounded with and in um, is very phobic.
yeah, I mean, that is an unfortunate reality, right? Like, kind of what tying back to what we were talking about in terms of dehumanization, like, that is at its core, when people see you less than human, then it's really hard to think about dignity, respect, because quite literally, the acceptable or socially acceptable normalized form is that you shouldn't exist, or like you're an abomination, an anomaly, something that shouldn't have happened, how it's portrayed as deviant, mentally ill. Like all those narratives start to come up, right? When you're thinking of this is something that is unnatural. And that's something that I have found is really interesting to unpack because I find the conversation gets really interesting when we start to talk about gender, sexual diversity within nature, and we talk about queer ecologies. And when we find those examples, then we're like, well, is the human species an anomaly that it just has a very like rigid binary? Because we see examples of queer ecologies across nature, right?
Yes.
And so yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of look at it that way because it is not unnatural and it's commonly framed that way as something that's deviating from the norm. And it that gets you a lot of violence in so many ways, institutional violence, interpersonal violence, like the systemic violence that you're being subjected to. So I think a lot of that is, it's difficult, right? Because it's something that is omnipresent, right? And it's always there. It never kind of goes away. But then, like, most people within these communities can kind of attest to that experience and it becomes part of it. And in some ways, I think then it leads you to find people that also have shared experiences with that. And then I have seen people form really strong bonds and connections, but I still think that I don't think we should be subjected to such dehumanizing forms of violence in order to build community, right?
Yeah,
Because but
yeah.
that is a reality that oftentimes I've heard firsthand from people, that that's how they actually meet other people, is after being subjected to violence. They try to find themselves and then they, start building connections, and that's how. But like, I do really think about, like, can we imagine different possibilities where that wasn't the case and we're not actually, like, our primary form of building community and relationships isn't tied to this normalization of violence,
Yeah, but you look around in any civil society, for any cause, violence has always been the catalyst of people coming together, asking for change, and be it in the political conflicts or sociological conflicts. I'd share one particular incident that really disturbed me massively was so, for example, in Delhi, in North, East, West Delhi, you will not see a lot of queer people openly admitting their identity. It's still very a casteist class divide. Once in one of the cosmetic clinics, I found a transgender who had come for the regular checkup. And just while talking, I looked at his hand and I saw marks. And he was regularly coming to remove those marks. And those were marks of like trying to kill oneself, commit suicide. Um, Committing suicide is the wrong terminology, but what I felt at that point of time was even that scar was a language. And those who do not understand the person, um, what will they understand the language of a scar? And this kind of it's worse than dehumanization. I mean, like the kind of agency that is taken away from a person just from the idea of them being different. I don't understand the terminologies of natural and normal. Whenever, someone tells me that this is the natural order of things or this is normal, and I'm like, who told you and what is it?
Yeah.
So nothing is natural or normal in life. Everything is supposedly natural or normal, or everything is unnatural and abnormal, if you want to say. It's always a status quo. But the question that has been asked by Gorang, who is one of our volunteers, is divinization of gender conformity. How can it help in humanizing LGBTQ rights?
So we're trying to see how that's connected.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I think we need to understand just intersections of any oppression, right? Is, like you said very beautifully, is the fact agency is taken away. It's about agency, it's about power, it's about control. And if we look at any form of oppression, it's about, subjugation, right? Like, you're trying to really find ways and ingrain that this person is less than. So I think one of the things that's really important, and I bring this up a lot, is when we talk about rights for queer, trans, gender diverse, gender nonconforming people, that's not any different than any other human being. or being for that matter, right? But it's framed because it's politicized, right? And it's framed as an anomaly because it's like, oh, that's something that's deviating from the norm. But it's actually, it is like if you're fighting for those rights, it's like you're fighting for any other human, animal, species rights. It should be the same thing. But I think it's often framed as something that is out of the ordinary. Like to your point earlier, like what is normal? What is like seen as standard? So I think that's the first thing we have to really think about because dehumanization, I think, is something that applies across context when we think of oppression. And that's why, like, one of the things that often comes up, right, like even in current struggles that we're seeing across the world in trying to fight for autonomy and self-determination, that's the same fight. And that's why a lot of people within the queer trans communities understand that struggle because they're constantly living through it. So when we're talking about rights, a lot of that has to do with being able to take back dignity and agency and recenter the focus that actually no one else should have power or control over your bodies. No one else should have control over the narratives that are portrayed. And I think so if we're talking about control of women's bodies, let's talk about reproductive justice. That is inherently tied to gender justice, right? And that is inherently tied to what we're talking about here today in terms of human rights for LGBTQ plus communities. And I think that is, we have to make sure that this is not seen as an exception, because oftentimes it is. And when it's seen as an exception, then the struggles become disconnected and we end up reproducing the type of dehumanization and violence that we're talking about. And the last thing I'll say is I often look at trans misogyny, and I think it's an interesting thing to kind of look at why it's really important to focus on and more people need to talk about it, because trans misogyny, oftentimes people think that it only impacts trans people, and I don't think that's true, because trans misogyny is, I would say, the overlap between misogyny and transphobia, but like definitionally. But I think it also speaks something greater that, and we've seen many examples of this even in popular media last year, right? Is anytime a woman doesn't conform to the dominant definition of who or what a woman is, and they deviate from that, then they face immense forms of violence. Now, if you look at that, you're going to the root cause, right? Like, and that also applies to masculinity, which is why I'm like, we have to look at it as connected and not an exception, because it will impact other people until they realize that that's the root cause. So that's why I'm like, we need to ground ourselves in that discussion that yes, reproductive justice is tied to gender justice, and that is tied to disability justice, and we can go so on. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah.
And our bodies are battlefields, in short. It's our bodies are battlefields, and along with that, what really, I find very interesting is the concept of this. There's a certain kind of fear of, more than misogyny and others, I think there's a fear of fluidity in religious discourse, in political discourse, in sociological discourses, because they're not able to put it under boxes. And when they're not able to put it under boxes, they're not able to define it. And when they're not able to define it, they're scared of it.
Yeah. I think that's a great observation. I would say it, honestly, why do we label people in the first place? It's because of control, right?
Yes.
Like, and you can't effectively like construct all of these systems and institutions that are designed to exploit without being able to control people in that way. You need to understand them. And I think that's where, like, a lot of the times what happens is when we can't understand someone's experience on our terms, then the default becomes, well, this is abnormal.
Yeah.
This is something that is different. I can't understand it. I can't make sense of it. Hence, that means that this person's wrong, or it's something that makes them a target for violence because it's something that is unnatural, right? And that's kind of what we've been talking about. But I do think that a lot of what you're naming there is just a matter of control and being able to box people. And that's the reality, is that's what we see across any dimension of identity you want to take. It's the same thing. You look at gender, you look at race, you look at disability, you look at caste, like all of that is, it has the same underlying logic of control.
Yeah,
Um,
it has. It has. In fact, one of the words that I really loathe is abnormal
mm,
because it means so much negativity, um, really projected onto someone. And it is a very, very cruel word.
mhm,
And Gorang is basically asking the, I don't know, JD Vance, your new president-elect, who is coming to office, yes, tomorrow, and is a millennial, hates cats and hardcore Catholic and childless people. Um, he's going to create a new era of ultra-conservative Catholicism in US. But do you think that there are churches in US or in the West that are much more open than temples or synagogues or mosques are about fluidity?
I mean, I would say even like I want to say that there's definitely pockets of fluidity across, right? And I think even like all the groups, like even if we want to look at organized religion, I think there's still so many examples of people that are doing very, very important and necessary work in reclaiming the narrative. So I think that's kind of as universal, even if we look at like the Abrahamic faiths, we look at different religions, it's like, so I do think it is kind of like a global struggle in that matter, right? And yeah, oftentimes I would also say like if we look at the current political climate here, there's a lot of violence that's already happening, and there's anticipatory violence of more to come right now. And the general discourse is there's a lot of valid fear. And I think oftentimes the discussions are always portrayed as like, oh, this is like a very safe haven for like, you know, LGBTQ plus communities, and like there's visibility here. And I'm like, it certainly has its challenges and it's tied to other forms. So if you want to look at specifically like gender diversity and gender diverse people that are indigenous and their experiences in the United States, you'll see immensely disproportionate forms of violence, right? Whether you want to look at Black communities, racialized communities, it's like it's intersectional, right? You can't
Yeah.
separate race from gender from all of that here. And I think that's something that has to kind of be challenged because oftentimes we see like, oh, the United States is portrayed as like the safe haven for gender diverse people. And in reality, that's not what we see on the ground. A lot of that just has to do with media and representation and how it's kind of framed. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing is also, this is something that I really try to think about a lot, is how do we measure progress? And I think, why is that an important question to ask? Because one of the, I guess, justifications I hear to, and we're seeing this in present day, right? Like one of the justifications that I hear are like, oh, look at those culturally backwards countries that are so violent towards queer and trans people, but they often overlook the same violence that happens on their own grounds, right? Like within their own communities, people don't talk about it, but they're very quick to be like, oh, look how bad human rights are there in that part of the world. And they probably can't even name it on a map, right? Where that's happening. But so I think it's really important to understand that, first of all, transphobia, homophobia, they're universal experiences. Yes, they're better in some countries, they're worse in others. That's a fact. But I think there's always still a fear of violence, right? Depending on where you are. So that's the first thing. Second thing is why I said, how do we measure progress? Because I've seen a lot of liberal discourse around this that is framed around the presence of pride in like its present form like pride parades, and they are seen as like kind of the pinnacle of measuring LGBTQ plus inclusion, representation, and social progress. And I think that's something to challenge because it's corporatized. It is
Yeah.
something that has just been pinkwashed, is corporatized in the sense that you're just portraying this like lens, and a lot of that just has to do with just dominant culture and throwing like it's tied to capitalism, right? When
Yeah.
we think of it. And I don't think that's a true measure of progress because it doesn't, you see a different reality on the ground. Like it's great that once a year you have a month, you fly all these blimps and put up these flags. And at the same time, I know that holds a lot of importance. Invisibility, I don't want to discredit that, but I'm also saying that part of our work, especially when we think of decolonial perspectives, is we have to really think expansively. Like, are there other ways to measure progress? And how, because pride also, if we look at pride in the US, for example, it's always been about resistance. It started as a form of protest. It was never about parades. And again, I'm not saying parades are bad, but like
No,
they're
I
great.
understand. Yeah.
Celebrate joy. They're great to, build community and all of that. But I think again, the discourse can't be that like we need to have pride parades everywhere across the world. And now we're like, because that won't get us anywhere, right? That will
Yeah,
not get us
it's very
anywhere.
cosmetic.
Yeah, even if we did have pride parades, well, like I think that's a question to ask, right? Even if we did have pride parades, every single country in the world, have we still meaningfully gotten rid of homophobia and transphobia? Or have we kind of achieved LGBTQ plus liberation? Absolutely not, right?
Yeah. No, it's very cosmetic because it's a very class divide that I see in the pride parades. In India, for example, pride parades can be seen in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad. But what about, because that is not all of India. These are the metro cities, there's a class divide. What about the 80% of the population that resides in, at least 60% of it, that resides in the rural areas, and how many of them are facing struggles that they cannot come out and just solve through a parade? First is that. Second, Gorang was asking also about, he said about the idea of Hinduism and divine legitimacy given to trans community. One thing which I want to note down here is that there was a book review that I did on a trans person, Manjama, from South India, who became a Jogati dancer, was born as a boy, turned into a Jogati dancer. And in South India, Jogati dancers are considered to be very divine and they never undergo any kind of surgical process because they believe that God has chosen them and they don't need a surgical process for sex change to, because then the divinity will be gone if they have a surgery. By the same time, in India, a lot of Jogatis, a lot of so-called trans who are considered divine are forced into prostitution. When COVID started, in Tamil Nadu, on the walls of villages, it was written that COVID is transmitted by trans. So, divinity is a very, it's a, what do you say? I think when anything is made divine, one has to be very careful of it because either that thing will be traumatized
Mm.
or
Mhm.
it will either have a lot of power, unnecessary power. Like when
Yeah.
kings are made divine, so they are ordained from God and have so much of power, like the royal family and God knows how many. So it doesn't make sense, because what I also see is during my work on COVID, I saw that in India, 1,500 rupees was given to the LGBTQ folks. 1,500 rupees a month. And for that, you needed to have a proper bank account, an ID card. And a lot of them don't choose to come under state surveillance and hence do not have such ID cards. They never got even this very meager amount of 1,500, which is like nothing. It's like 15 pounds a month, kind of, or 15, dollars or $20 a month. So, what is the condition in US, for example? Um, do you see that when compared to South Asia or North Africa, um, what is the amount of aid that is given to them by the state in uncertain circumstances?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the US is, at least speaking in the US context, I can say it's kind of really challenging because there's no universal experience, right? And it's a very complicated, I would say, a complex political structure to navigate too, because there's some things that fall under state legislation, some things that fall under federal legislation. So it really depends on that too, because if you look at the past year, there were like over some like countless anti number of anti-trans bills that were passed last year alone, right? I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but like yeah, like there's definitely that. And the other thing I'll say is like any other place, quite literally, there's a lot of work that does happen, but a lot I would say a lot of that comes from people, like community work, right? Whether
Yeah.
that's through the structure of nonprofits or grassroots organizing or just political activism, that's where a lot of the work comes from. Um, I think there's definitely different like forms of representation that happen. So that's definitely something to kind of think about too, where like is there like more visible representation and kind of going back to your question, like earlier, and the point that you made around like divinity and like we have to be mindful of how that's playing a role. I think one of the way I kind of see that is it's still dehumanization, I would say, is a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
Because once you see either, oh, this person is abnormal and less than human, they don't deserve to live, versus this person possesses some godly powers, or because or on the other side you're also looking at sexualization of trans bodies and like hypersexualization of trans bodies, so it's like there's so many, and I would say all of that is the spectrum of dehumanization, right? Because whether you see someone as holding some like unearthly powers or you see them as less than human, you're still not allowing them the agency to just like, exist in a way that's dignified. So I think that's definitely something to kind of think about too, because um like one of the things that I often see is like even so I do a lot of work in fashion and specifically with queer and trans communities, and I think one of the things that I've seen is there was a slight uptick in like, oh yes, we're open to having, models that are gender diverse, but at the same time only those models that still fit within our current binary and definition. And I thought that's really interesting to think about. So, yes, they would have a model who's transgender and they're open to having them as long as they can perfectly fit within either role. And but that kind of defeats the purpose, right? Then that's where I would say representation politics plays a role, is are we actually achieving anything from that? And yes, there's still some degree of like, validity to the fact that like, oh, we have representation, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that representation can only go so far when it's not actually grounded in a liberatory framework of
Yeah.
trying
Yeah.
to, achieve dignity.
I mean, just think about women parliamentarians. That's a certain kind of gender washing that happens,
Mm,
that you have women MPs, but what are the women-centric agendas that you have passed in the lower or upper house? Very few.
mhm.
How many of them really come out and talk about gender-based violence? Very few.
Yeah.
So that is also a very interesting case in itself. And Ari is finally speaking and saying that both divinity and oppression are at margins. And the next question, and my last question to you, is how do you define fashion and beauty?
Oof, that's a good question. I mean, to me, a lot of that has to just do with creating a space like where people can kind of celebrate themselves, right? Because again, beauty is subjective, number one, but it's also tied to dominant cultural norms. We can't deny that. And that kind of gets into like racial um, I guess racial categories. It gets into fat phobia, transphobia. Like there it's the whole nexus of who is considered beautiful or not, and how do we define beauty, and how is it represented in like culture and media. And I think to me, if you really want to work in this space, then a lot of that has to do with like deconstructing this idea of who is, and that's like the point that I was making earlier, right? Where you have representation, but as long as the representation conforms to the current standard ideals, then that actually doesn't get us anywhere, because it's not about just changing the face. It's about, you know, changing the structure ground from the top to the bottom.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece that's really important. So yeah, when you think of even fashion and beauty, I think it's very subjective. And I mean, this sounds more like a cheesy answer, but it's like it's true, right? Like if you're thinking about it, it's really about being able to allow people the space to express themselves, right? In a way that lets them feel confident. Self-confidence is really important. They can exercise their agency, and more importantly, just yeah, autonomy. And I think a lot of that you can kind of see are like struggles to like especially for women and gender diverse people to kind of even wear what they want to, right?
Yeah.
And it goes both ways, right? Like, and so I think that's definitely something that is very important to kind of see, because fashion is inherently political, right? And it also has a lot to do with control, like we talked about.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah.
And in the end, everyone who will be watching it on YouTube, this podcast, and internally they find themselves at a crossroads in reclaiming their own identity. What do you want to say to them?
Hmm. I think it that's it's a difficult question, but because I feel like it's very personal and it means different things to different people. But I would say that it is a process, and it is a process that is slow often and takes time, and it just unravels on its own time, on its own scale, I guess, time scale too. Because I would say identity is something that is emergent, right? Like people are constantly changing, your understanding's changing, and whatever the case, it still is valid, right? Like I often see people being like, well, you only realize that, like, I mean, one of the critiques that I see, so I actually have a lot of friends that later on in their lifetime, as late as like their 70s,
Wow.
realized that they identify as transgender, and that's how they live their life. And some of them were like, oh, I've always felt this way, and only now am I actually, going through the process of transitioning. Some of them don't go through the process of transitioning. So it's like there's so many things to kind of think about, but that doesn't invalidate your experience. And I think that's the only, if there's one takeaway from this whole conversation, I think that's the main takeaway, that at the end of the day, you have the power to kind of reclaim your agency, and no one can deny or change that. And that's not to say that there won't be repercussions or different forms of violence or consequences, but at the end of the day, it's like you have to kind of live and own your reality in a way that feels dignifying to you. And there is a lot of power in that. There's a lot of power in doing that for sure.
Yeah. You remind me of this particular saying that sometimes to be who you are and not the what the world is trying to make you into is at times a revolution in itself.
Mhm.
And thank you so much for being that revolution in your own way. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to steal away your clothes. But at the same time, I'm very, very thankful that you shared with us these insights because these are very important. And especially in India and many parts of South Asia, we come from societies where the entire conversation like this will be completely ridiculed. Um, and So that makes me very, very thankful to you for taking our time and conversing. A lot of our students are having a fan moment, but I'm not going to name them. But thank you so much for the work that you do and for all your sassy work and the energy that you bring and your humility to laugh at my jokes too. I'm very thankful to you for that. And we all are very, very, we wish you the very best for all your future endeavors, one
Yeah,
day at a
no,
time.
absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. And yeah, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. So I think it will be a rich conversation to come back to for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Just a sec.